In the quiet ledgers of American history, where darkness is often chronicled in the grand, violent acts of men, there are stories that lie buried beneath the veneer of the everyday. The year 1832 in the state of Delaware is remembered for its debates on abolition and the steady rhythm of its agricultural life, not for a terror that took root in the pastoral silence of a lone farm. History rarely looks for monsters in the person of a simple housewife, tending to her land with quiet dignity. Yet, the frozen earth of a small homestead near the Maryland border held a secret far colder than the winter frost, a grim narrative written by a widow's hand, hidden just behind the weathered planks of her barn. If the forgotten corridors of history are where you choose to walk, and this is your first time joining our inquiry, consider subscribing to our circle and ensure you are present as every disquieting file is unsealed. The land itself seemed to breathe a sigh of exhausted peace in that winter of 1832. Delaware, a state caught in the quiet tension between the industrial North and the agrarian South, was a place of rolling fields and dense, ancient woodlands, its character defined by the patient turning of the seasons. The farms were modest, practical affairs, separated by long stretches of muddy, rutted roads that turned to iron in the cold. Here, life was measured in cords of wood stacked against the coming snow and the yield of the autumn harvest. It was a landscape that promised tranquility, a place where the loudest sounds were the wind moving through bare oak branches and the distant, rhythmic chop of an axe. The air was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, a smell of wholesome, unending labor. But on the outskirts of the small, unincorporated community of Blackbird Hundred, one particular homestead possessed a stillness that felt different. It was not the earned quiet of a day's work completed, but a profound and unsettling silence, a void in the natural tapestry of the countryside. This was the Crandall Farm, a plot of land that seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Here, Lydia Crandall worked her acreage alone. She was a woman etched by the sun and the harshness of the land, her frame spare but strong, her movements economical and precise. Her husband, Abram, had been taken by a fever 2 winters prior, leaving her with 40 acres of tilled soil, a small but sturdy farmhouse, and a large, imposing barn painted a shade of red that had faded to the color of dried blood. In the wake of Abram's passing, the community had expected her to sell the land, to retreat to the modest comfort of a smaller town or live with relatives. It was the sensible path, the one prescribed for a widow left to fend for herself against the unforgiving realities of farm life. Lydia, however, did no such thing. She remained. Her neighbors watched, first with pity, then with a grudging, distant admiration, as she took up her husband's work with a discipline that bordered on ferocious. She rose before the sun, its weak winter light finding her already mending a fence or drawing water from the well, the steam of her breath a fleeting cloud in the frigid air. She was a fixture of the landscape, as constant and unyielding as the ancient stones that bordered her property. Her hands, though chapped and calloused, showed a surprising delicacy when she tended to the small plot of withered herbs near her porch, a garden Abram had planted for her in their first year of marriage. It was her one visible concession to sentiment, a quiet, almost imperceptible nod to the life that had been. Margaret Tolliver, whose own farm lay a good mile to the east, would sometimes see Lydia from a distance while traveling to the mill. She would watch the solitary figure moving across the fields, a small, dark shape against the vast, pale canvas of the winter sky. Margaret remarked to her husband on more than one occasion that the widow Crandall possessed a fortitude that seemed almost unnatural, a self-sufficiency that felt less like strength and more like an impenetrable wall. There was an isolation about Lydia that went beyond mere solitude. She attended church services sporadically, sitting alone in the rearmost pew, her gaze fixed on Minister Obadiah Kent, but her presence oddly detached, as if she were merely an observer of her own life. She acknowledged greetings with a curt, polite nod, but never lingered for the customary post-sermon gossip. Her trips into the small nearby settlement for supplies were brief and purposeful. She would trade her preserved goods and smoked meats with a quiet efficiency, her words few and her eyes revealing nothing. The townspeople saw a woman of immense control, a respectable widow bearing her grief with a stoic dignity that was both admirable and vaguely unnerving. They respected her privacy, for in that time and place, self-reliance was a virtue of the highest order. Yet, whispers followed her like a shadow. They were not born of malice, not initially, but of a deep, instinctual unease that the community could not quite name. The talk centered, always, on the barn. It was a large, well-maintained structure, its timber frame solid, its roof sound. But unlike the other barns in the area, which were hubs of constant activity, resonant with the lowing of cattle and the bleating of sheep, Lydia's barn was silent, utterly silent. No livestock was ever seen entering or leaving its great heavy doors. No farmhands were ever hired to help with the supposed work within. The loft, which should have been overflowing with hay for the winter, appeared empty from the road. The barn stood as a sealed, inscrutable monument at the heart of her property. Children playing in the woods that bordered her land would dare each other to approach it, only to retreat, claiming the air around it felt colder, the silence heavier. Farmers passing on the main road noted how Lydia always kept the barn doors barred, secured with a thick wooden beam and a heavy iron lock that seemed excessive for a structure that ostensibly held nothing of value. The building was her private domain, a place no one but she had entered since Abram's death. This obsessive privacy began to curdle the community's admiration into a quiet, fearful suspicion. What work could a lone woman have in such a large, empty building that required such secrecy? The question hung in the air at the general store, in the pews after the minister's sermons, and over dinner tables throughout the 100, an unspoken, collective puzzle. This feeling was not confined to the locals who had known Lydia for years. It was felt most acutely perhaps by those who were merely passing through. Jonas Blythe, a peddler whose route took him through the back roads of Kent County twice a year, made it a point to hurry his wagon when he passed the Crandall homestead. He later recounted to fellow travelers in a tavern that the farm was the quietest piece of land he had ever encountered. He spoke not of a peaceful quiet, but of a dead, oppressive stillness. There were no dogs to bark at his approach, no chickens scratching in the yard, no signs of life beyond the thin curl of smoke rising from the farmhouse chimney. The very land seemed to have been muted, the bird song ceasing as he drew near her property line, the rustle of unseen animals in the undergrowth falling silent. The house itself was immaculate, its windows clean, its porch swept, but it had the sterile, unwelcoming air of a place not truly lived in. Jonas told anyone who would listen that there was a wrongness to the place, a profound sense of absence where there should have been life. The focus of his unease, like that of the neighbors, was the barn. He described how it dominated the property, its faded red color seeming to absorb the light, its great dark maw of a door facing away from the road as if to hide its purpose. He said that to look at it for too long was to feel as though you yourself were being watched from the shadows within its silent, cavernous interior. The structure stood motionless in the winter dusk, a silent sentinel against a sky the color of slate. The last vestiges of daylight clung to the frost on its roof, making it glimmer with a cold, spectral light. The surrounding trees, their branches skeletal and black, seemed to lean away from it, granting it a wide, empty berth. Snow had begun to fall, thick, heavy flakes that drifted down without a sound. blanketing the fields and further muffling a world that was already preternaturally quiet. The snow collected on the heavy crossbeam that barred the barn doors, softening its hard lines but somehow making it look even more impenetrable. As darkness consumed the landscape, the barn became a hulking shape, a block of pure black against the graying fields. No light emanated from it, no sound escaped its walls. It was a place of secrets, a repository of the unspoken, its presence a constant, low thrum of menace in the heart of the seemingly peaceful Delaware countryside. The core of the farm's mystery, and the source of all the unspoken fear, lay behind those doors. What they concealed was a question that no one yet dared to ask, but one that would soon demand an answer that would shatter the tranquility of this quiet corner of the world and reveal the true nature of the disciplined, solitary woman who called that silent, waiting land her home. The year 1832 was a precarious time for a person of color in the state of Delaware. The state existed in a liminal space, its laws and its people caught between the rigid slave economy of the South and the burgeoning abolitionist sentiment of the North. For the free black population, life was a tapestry of hard-won liberties and constant, looming threats. The specter of kidnapping by slave catchers, who often disregarded legal papers, was a daily reality. For those who had escaped bondage, Delaware was a treacherous corridor on the long road to freedom, a place where a friendly face could be a mask for betrayal, and every wooded path could hide an ambush. Through this uncertain landscape, a steady stream of individuals moved, guided by whispers of safe routes and the desperate hope for work. They were men and women seeking a day's wage to buy food, a temporary haven to rest their weary bodies, or simply a kind word to fortify their spirits. They traveled the same muddy roads as the peddlers and farmers, but their journey was weighted with a peril others could not comprehend. It was in this climate of quiet desperation that Lydia Crandall's behavior underwent a subtle but significant transformation. The woman who had for 2 years maintained a hermetic and unapproachable existence began to show a new, outward-facing demeanor. It was a change noticed by her few neighbors, who observed it with a mixture of relief and confusion. Carts and wagons that had once passed her property without a second glance were now sometimes hailed. A traveler, weary from the road, might be offered a cool drink from her well. A man seeking employment might be engaged in a brief, quiet conversation at her fence line. To the outside world, it appeared as though the widow was slowly emerging from the long shadow of her grief, cautiously re-engaging with the world around her. Margaret Tolliver commented to her husband that it was a blessing to see Lydia showing some Christian charity, though she could not shake the feeling that something about these interactions was amiss. They were too calculated, too devoid of genuine warmth. Lydia's face, when she spoke to these strangers, remained a placid, unreadable mask. She offered help not with the open heart of a neighbor, but with the detached precision of a spider setting its web. Her farm, once a place of profound silence and isolation, now became a quiet, intermittent destination for the vulnerable, a place where the promise of a meal or a few coins drew the hopeful and the desperate into its orbit. David Green and his sister, Ruth, were 2 such travelers. They had been born free in Maryland, but after the death of their parents, they found their prospects dwindling, and the threat of the state's increasingly restrictive laws growing ever more tangible. David was a young man of 20, strong of back and skilled with his hands. He possessed a quiet optimism, a belief that honest work would always see them through. In his pocket, he carried a small, intricately carved wooden wren, a gift he had made for Ruth to remind her of the bird song from the woods behind their childhood home. It was his one small treasure. Ruth, younger by 2 years, was more cautious, her gaze constantly scanning the horizon for potential threats. Her trust was a thing not easily given. Their plan was to make their way to Philadelphia, where they had distant relatives and the promise of a more secure life. When they heard whispers in a small community about a widow who sometimes paid for help with chores on her farm, David saw it as a sign of providence. Ruth felt a prickle of unease, an instinct she could not articulate. She argued that the stories were too vague, that it was better to keep moving. David, ever the pragmatist, insisted that a day's wages would mean they would not have to sleep in the cold for the next 2 nights. He said they had to take opportunities where they found them. Their arrival at the Crandall farm was met with the same disquieting stillness that Jonas Blythe had described. Lydia met them at the edge of her yard, her expression neither welcoming nor hostile. She listened to David's polite offer of labor with an unnerving calm. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, seemed to assess his physical strength, his calloused hands, the weariness in his posture. She told him that a section of fence near the barn needed mending, and that she would pay him a fair price for a day's work. She offered them both a bowl of warm stew, which they ate huddled together on the steps of her porch, the first real meal they had had in days. The food was hearty, and Lydia's manner, while distant, was not unkind. Ruth's fears began to subside. Lydia instructed Ruth to wait for her brother by the old stone wall at the turn in the road, explaining that she did not want her loitering on the property while David worked. She said he would be finished before sundown. David gave his sister the small wooden bird, telling her to hold it for him and that he would be back with money in his pocket before the evening chill set in. Ruth watched him walk toward the great red barn, a sturdy, hopeful figure against the backdrop of the bleak landscape. She then dutifully made her way to the designated waiting spot, her brother's small carving a comforting solid weight in her hand. The afternoon wore on, the sun a pale, watery disk in the sky. The silence of the farm settled back in, broken only by the cawing of a distant crow. As the light began to fade, casting long, distorted shadows across the fields, Ruth's anxiety returned, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. Sundown came and went. The air grew sharp with frost. There was no sign of David. After another hour, her fear overriding Lydia's instructions, she crept back toward the farm. The house was dark, except for a single candle flickering in a window. She called her brother's name, her voice sounding small and thin in the vast emptiness. There was no reply. She gathered her courage and knocked on the farmhouse door. After a long moment, Lydia opened it, her face impassive in the candlelight. Ruth asked where her brother was. The widow stated, in a flat, even tone, that the man had finished his work hours ago. She said she had paid him what they agreed upon and that he had left immediately, saying he was in a hurry to get to the next town. Ruth, her voice trembling, insisted that he would never have left without her. Lydia's expression did not change. She simply repeated that he was gone. Then she closed the door, leaving Ruth alone in the suffocating darkness. Weeks later, another man named Isaiah Fletcher was seen walking that same stretch of road. Isaiah was a large, powerfully built man, known for his ability to find work clearing land, his strength and endurance a valuable commodity. He was also known for his voice, a deep and resonant baritone he used to sing spirituals as he walked, the sound a comfort to himself and a surprise to those who heard it echoing through the woods. He had a wife and child in Wilmington and was making his way back to them after a long stint of work further south. He was last seen by the peddler, Jonas Blythe, who was on his way back through the area. Jonas later reported that he had stopped to share a bit of bread and water with Isaiah. He said Isaiah seemed in good spirits, eager to be home. Isaiah had mentioned that he planned to stop at the Crandall farm, having heard the widow might pay a good price for someone to clear a field of stubborn tree stumps behind her barn. Jonas recalled feeling a familiar chill at the mention of the place. He advised Isaiah to be cautious, repeating his belief that the farm was not a right place. Isaiah, a practical man not given to superstition, had simply thanked him for the warning and continued on his way, his powerful voice soon fading down the road. He was never seen again. No one in his family or his community ever heard from him. His journey home, his songs, his very existence, all seemed to terminate in the profound and unnatural silence of Lydia Crandall's land. The disappearances were not connected by the authorities or even, at first, by the scattered and vulnerable community they came from. They were simply registered as 2 more souls lost to the treacherous uncertainties of the road, 2 more families left to wonder and grieve. But the pattern had begun, a quiet, methodical culling taking place just out of sight. Each time a visitor arrived, drawn by the promise of charity, the cycle repeated itself. The brief, almost hopeful interaction at the edge of the property. The offer of work, always centered around the imposing red barn, and then the inevitable final act. As dusk fell on the day Isaiah Fletcher was last seen, a heavy wooden beam was slid into place across the inside of the barn doors. The sound was a dull, heavy thud, a sound of absolute finality that did not carry beyond the confines of the farm. It sealed the cavernous space off from the world, muffling the wind, the rustle of the trees, the sounds of the encroaching night. Within those walls, a different kind of silence reigned, a thick, waiting stillness that absorbed all sound and all light, a void where hope and life were systematically extinguished. The question was no longer what secrets the barn held, but why no one who entered its suffocating darkness ever returned to the world of the living. The barn was a world unto itself, a place governed by its own laws of physics and time. To step across its threshold was to leave the open, honest air of the fields behind and enter a space thick with the accumulated dust of years and the scent of decay that was not entirely of rotting hay. The light that filtered through the grimy, cobwebbed windows and the narrow gaps between the wall slats was weak and thin, painting stripes of gray across the packed earth floor. It was a cathedral of shadows, its high, vaulted ceiling lost in darkness, its vast interior filled with the relics of a farm life that no longer existed. Old harnesses, brittle with age, hung from wooden pegs. A rusted plow blade leaned against a wall, its iron surface flaking away. In one corner sat a stack of moldering burlap sacks, and in another, a collection of tools. A heavy wood-splitting maul, a coil of thick rope, and a broad-bladed felling axe, its edge kept unnaturally keen. This was Lydia Crandall's workshop, the silent stage upon which her true work was performed. The process was always the same, a ritual refined through grim repetition. The lure was simple, an appeal to the most basic of human needs. For a man like David Green, it was the promise of a few coins to ease his sister's hunger. For Isaiah Fletcher, it was the prospect of a day's hard labor to bring him closer to his family. She would lead them toward the barn, her demeanor calm and businesslike, explaining the task at hand. It might be a request to move a heavy timber, to inspect the loft for leaks, or to clear stones from the ground just behind the structure. Her voice never betrayed the slightest hint of what was to come. She moved with an unhurried, deliberate grace, her victim following a few steps behind, his mind on the work and the payment, his senses perhaps registering the coldness of the air or the unnatural quiet, but dismissing it as a trick of the mind. The victim was made to turn his back, to focus on the promised task. That was the fulcrum of the entire act. She required their focus to be elsewhere, their guard completely lowered by the mundane nature of the request. In the final moments, there would be a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a change in the quality of the silence. The victim might sense a presence behind him, a sudden drawing in of the world's breath. He might begin to turn, a question forming on his lips, his brow furrowed in confusion rather than fear. But the turn was never completed. The blow came from behind, swift and brutally efficient, aimed at the base of the skull. It was not the act of a person lost to rage. There was no fury in the movement. It was a precise, economical application of force, like a butcher felling an ox. The weapon varied, chosen with a chilling practicality. For a smaller man, a heavy hammer from the tool wall would suffice. For a larger, more powerful man like Isaiah, she used the felling axe, its weight and sharp edge ensuring the task was completed with a single, devastating strike. The sound was a sickening, muffled crack, a sound that was immediately swallowed by the dense, dusty air of the barn. There was no cry, only a sudden, convulsive shudder of the body as it collapsed into a heap on the hay-strewn floor. After the act, Lydia's movements remained methodical, her composure absolute. There was no pause for reflection, no recoil from the horror she had just perpetrated. The body was now merely an object, a problem to be dealt with. She would drag the dead man by his feet, his worn boots tracing two parallel lines in the dirt and straw, out of the barn's side door and toward the small, neglected apple orchard that bordered the property. The orchard was a place of gnarled, twisted trees, their branches bare and claw-like against the winter sky. Under the thin, hard-packed soil, a grim harvest was slowly accumulating. The graves were always shallow, dug with the same relentless efficiency as the murder itself. The shovel striking the frozen ground was the only sound, a rhythmic, percussive scraping that echoed faintly in the cold, still air. She did not dig deep, only enough to conceal her work from a casual glance. The earth was hastily shoveled back, the surface smoothed over with a crude approximation of its original state, a few scattered leaves and twigs a final, careless concealment. She worked without a lantern, her eyes long adjusted to the gloom, navigating the orchard by the faint light of the moon or stars. The moonlight, when it was strong, would cut through the slats of the barn wall, illuminating the aftermath within. It would fall upon the dark, spreading stain on the hay, the discarded tool, the scattered contents of the victim's pockets, transforming a scene of brutal violence into a silent, terrible tableau. This grim pattern continued, unseen and unsuspected. Another traveler, a young man named Samuel Drury, had a fortunate, if terrifying, encounter that hinted at the darkness he had narrowly escaped. He had been walking from Smyrna to Dover, and the day was growing late. He saw the Crandall farm and, remembering hearing of the widow who sometimes offered work, decided to inquire. He found Lydia mending a harness in the yard, her hands moving with a sure, steady rhythm. He asked if she had any chores that needed doing in exchange for a meal. Her eyes, he later recalled, were the most unsettling feature. They were pale and empty, and as they looked him over, he felt not as if he were being seen, but as if he were being weighed and measured. She agreed, telling him she needed some loose boards in the barn's loft secured before the next storm. She led him inside. The moment he stepped into the oppressive dimness, a powerful sense of dread washed over him. The air was heavy and stale, and he could smell something else beneath the scent of old wood and hay, something metallic and faintly sweet. He saw the tools hanging on the wall, the felling axe glinting in a stray beam of light. He looked up at the loft, a place of impenetrable darkness. She told him to climb the ladder. He took one step toward it, then stopped. He could not explain the feeling, a primal instinct that screamed at him to flee. He turned to her and, stammering an apology, said he suddenly felt unwell and had to be on his way. He expected anger or annoyance. Instead, her face remained perfectly placid. She simply nodded, as if his departure was of no consequence at all. He backed out of the barn and did not stop walking, his pace quickening to a run, until the farm was a distant speck behind him. He did not know what he had escaped, but the memory of the cold barn and the widow's empty eyes would haunt his sleep for years. Jonas Blythe, the peddler, passed the farm again in the late autumn. He noticed that the silence around the property seemed to have deepened, to have taken on a heavier, more malevolent quality. He remembered his brief conversation with Isaiah Fletcher, the man's cheerful voice and his stated intention to stop at the widow's. Jonas had not seen or heard of Isaiah since, and a cold certainty began to form in his mind. He looked toward the red barn, which stood like a blood-red tombstone against the gray sky, and felt a profound sense of guilt and fear. He had warned the man, but his warning had been too gentle, too easily dismissed as mere superstition. Now, he felt he was an unwitting witness to something terrible. He hurried his horse, the wheels of his cart seeming to thunder in the oppressive quiet. He felt the unseen gaze of the place on his back, a cold pressure that did not relent until he was miles away. The question of what was happening on that isolated plot of land began to evolve in his mind. It was no longer a simple matter of a reclusive woman and a strange, silent barn. It was a question of disappearance, a question of finality. He, like Samuel Drury, had felt the presence of a profound and deliberate evil, a force that actively consumed those who came too close. The motive remained a complete and terrifying mystery. It was not simple greed. The men who disappeared were poor, carrying little of value. It was not a sudden, passionate crime. The methodical repetition suggested a cold, calculated purpose. Whether it was born of a deep-seated hatred, a twisted sense of thrift, or a mind that had become unmoored from humanity, the result was the same. Behind the facade of the respectable, hard-working widow, a predator was at work, using the promise of Christian charity as her bait and the dark, silent barn as her slaughterhouse. The quiet unease that had long hovered over the Crandall farm began to coalesce, like frost forming on a window pane, into definite shapes of suspicion. It was no longer a vague feeling confined to the whispers of children or the private thoughts of a passing peddler. The threads of disconnected events, of disappearances and strange observations, were beginning to be pulled together by different hands in different places, slowly weaving a tapestry of profound and terrible implication. The community's willful ignorance, its polite deference to a widow's privacy, was starting to fray under the strain of a fear that could no longer be dismissed as mere country superstition. The silence from Lydia Crandall's land was beginning to be answered by a rising murmur from the world around it. Margaret Tolliver, a woman whose life was grounded in the practical and the observable, found herself increasingly troubled by the small inconsistencies she noted from her distant vantage point. Her concern was not for herself, but for the moral fabric of the community, a fabric she felt was being stretched to its breaking point. One afternoon, while gathering fallen branches at the edge of her own property, she saw Lydia in the apple orchard. It was not the time of year for harvesting, and Lydia was not carrying a basket. She was carrying a shovel. Margaret watched as the widow moved between the gnarled trees, her posture rigid, her focus absolute. Lydia was not digging, but tamping down the earth in several spots, her movements economical and firm. The sight was deeply unsettling. An orchard was for fruit, for life. To see it being used like a work site, to witness the earth being packed down with such deliberate finality, struck Margaret as a profound violation of the natural order. Later that week, she noticed something else. The wind, blowing from the direction of the Crandall farm, carried a faint, unpleasant odor. It was not the familiar smell of wood smoke or manure, but a sickly sweet, cloying scent that caught in the back of her throat. She mentioned it to her husband, who told her she was imagining things, that it was likely just a fox den or some other natural decay. But Margaret knew the smells of the countryside, and this was a smell she had never encountered, a smell of hidden corruption. She began to speak more openly of her unease, telling her closest neighbors that something was wrong at the widow's place, that the woman's isolation had curdled into something unnatural and perhaps dangerous. Her words, coming from a woman known for her level-headedness, began to give the formless whispers a new and troubling weight. While Margaret's suspicions grew from observation, Ruth Green's were born of a desperate, gnawing certainty. She had not left the area after that terrible night. She remained, a ghost haunting the edges of the community, her grief a raw and open wound. She had lost her only family, the one person who anchored her to the world. Lydia's cold dismissal of her questions had not satisfied her. It had ignited in her a fierce, unyielding resolve. She knew her brother. David was responsible and caring. He would never have taken payment and abandoned her in a strange place. The widow's story was a lie, and in that lie, Ruth sensed a terrible truth. She began a quiet, solitary investigation, a dangerous undertaking for a young black woman in a land where her own freedom was tenuous. She walked the roads, her brother's small wooden wren clutched in her hand, its smooth, familiar shape a small comfort against the enormity of her fear. She asked questions at mills and general stores, her inquiries cautious, her eyes searching the faces of strangers for any flicker of recognition, any scrap of information. Most people dismissed her, their faces shuddered with indifference or suspicion, but a few listened. An old farmer remembered seeing a young man matching David's description walking toward the Crandall place. A woman recalled hearing about other travelers who had gone to the farm seeking work and had not been seen since. Each small piece of information was a confirmation of her worst fears. Her quest eventually led her to Jonas Blythe, who had stopped at a trading post to replenish his supplies. He overheard her hesitant questions to the storekeeper and recognized the description of the farm, the silent barn, the unsettling widow. He approached her, his face grim. He told her about Isaiah Fletcher, about the man's cheerful song and his intention to work for the widow. He described his own profound sense of dread concerning the farm, a dread he now saw mirrored in Ruth's haunted eyes. Their conversation, held in low, urgent tones in a dusty corner of the store, was a pivotal moment. Two separate disappearances, two strong, capable men, were now bound by a single terrifying location, Lydia Crandall's barn. The pattern was no longer a matter of speculation. It was a clear and horrifying reality. Jonas, burdened by his conscience, felt he could no longer remain a passive observer. The knowledge that he might have been one of the last people to see Isaiah Fletcher alive was a weight he could not bear in silence. Armed with the story of David Green, he knew he had to speak to someone with authority, someone the community would listen to. He sought out Minister Obadiah Kent. The minister was a man of stern principles but a compassionate heart, a man who believed in the inherent goodness of his flock. He listened patiently as Jonas laid out the story, his brow furrowed in concentration. The peddler's tale was compelling, but it was still just that, a tale based on feelings and coincidences. The minister was hesitant to cast such a dark shadow of suspicion upon a widow, a member of his own congregation who had already suffered a great loss. He counseled caution, suggesting that there could be other explanations, that the men could have simply moved on, as was the way of travelers. It was then that Ruth Green, emboldened by Jonas's support, came to the church. She stood before the minister, her small frame trembling but her voice steady, and told him of her brother. She spoke of his kindness, his reliability, and his love for her. She showed the minister the small wooden bird, explaining that it was a piece of his heart and that he would never have left it behind. Her testimony was not a collection of second-hand stories. It was the raw, undeniable voice of personal loss. Her grief was a palpable force in the quiet, sun-drenched sanctuary. It was this, more than anything, that swayed the minister. He looked from Ruth's tear-filled eyes to Jonas's grim, determined face and realized that to do nothing was to be complicit. The possibility of such evil festering within his own community, hidden behind a facade of piety and grief, was something he had to confront. Reverend Kent decided that action, however unpleasant, was now a moral imperative. He gathered a small group of trusted men from his congregation, including Margaret Tolliver's husband, who was now convinced by his wife's persistent and detailed observations. The minister explained the situation, his voice low and somber, emphasizing that they were not seeking vigilantism, but answers. Their purpose was to investigate the claims, to determine if there was any truth to the terrible suspicions that had been raised. They would approach the farm under the cover of night, not to accuse, but to search. The decision was made to focus on the apple orchard, the place where Margaret had seen Lydia tamping down the earth. As dusk settled, casting the Delaware landscape in shades of purple and deep blue, the small party made its way to the Crandall homestead. They carried lanterns and shovels, their faces grim in the flickering light. The farm was as silent as ever, the house dark, the barn a block of impenetrable shadow. The men moved quietly, their boots sinking into the soft, damp soil of the fields. The air in the orchard was cold and still, the gnarled branches of the apple trees like skeletal arms reaching for them in the darkness. The swaying lanterns cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock their grim purpose, turning the familiar landscape into a place of grotesque and alien forms. They began to dig. The sound of the shovels biting into the earth was shockingly loud in the profound silence. They worked with a grim determination, the lantern light glinting off the wet metal of the blades. For a long while, they found nothing but roots and stones. The minister began to fear he had made a terrible mistake, that he was leading these men on a fool's errand that would only desecrate a widow's property and reputation. But Ruth's desolate face was burned into his memory, and he urged them to keep searching. One of the men, digging near the base of an ancient twisted tree, grunted. He said his shovel had struck something. He told the others it was not the hard, grating sound of rock, but a dull, soft thud, a different sound. The other men fell silent, their shovels frozen in midair. They gathered around him, their lanterns held high, casting a pool of yellow light on the disturbed ground. All eyes were fixed on that single spot, every man holding his breath, their hearts pounding in the terrible, waiting silence. The question of proof, of whether anyone could truly know what Lydia had done, was about to be answered by the cold, unforgiving earth. The earth, once a silent accomplice, now became the principal accuser. The soft thud that had stopped the men's shovels was the sound of a truth that could no longer be buried. With renewed and fearful urgency, they scraped away the remaining layers of soil. The lantern light fell upon the decaying fabric of a burlap sack, and then, horrifically, upon the unmistakable shape of a human hand, its fingers curled in the cold, dark soil. A collective gasp, a sound of profound shock and revulsion, rippled through the small group of men. The minister, his face as pale as ash, knelt and recited a prayer, his voice a trembling whisper against the vast, indifferent silence of the night. The discovery of that first shallow grave opened a floodgate. The men, their earlier hesitation replaced by a grim, methodical fury, moved through the orchard like avenging spirits. They found another grave, and then a third, each one a testament to the methodical and horrifying work that had been taking place in this secluded corner of the world. The bodies were in varying states of decay, their identities obscured by the earth and time, but their presence was an irrefutable scream of violence that shattered the pastoral peace of the Delaware countryside forever. The sickly sweet smell that Margaret Tolliver had noticed on the wind now had a source, a tangible and stomach-turning reality. The secrets of the silent barn were no longer contained within its blood-red walls. They were being exhumed, one terrible shovelful at a time, under the cold, unblinking eyes of the stars. The sun had not yet risen when Constable Ezra Bell was summoned. He was a practical, no-nonsense man, his career largely spent dealing with property disputes and the occasional drunken brawl. What he found in Lydia Crandall's orchard was something for which his years of service had left him entirely unprepared. He stood at the edge of the desecrated ground, his lantern held high, its light illuminating the grim tableau of unearthed remains and the exhausted, haunted faces of the minister and his men. The constable, a man not easily shaken, felt a cold dread seep into his bones. This was not a crime of passion. This was a ledger of death, a systematic extermination. He secured the area and then, with two of the townsmen as witnesses, he walked the short distance to the farmhouse. The building was dark and silent, as if sleeping, oblivious to the horrors that had been revealed just yards from its door. He pounded on the thick oak door, his fist making a sound like a drumbeat in the pre-dawn stillness. After a long moment, a light appeared in a window, and the door creaked open. Lydia Crandall stood there, holding a single candle. Her face, illuminated from below by the flickering flame, was a mask of placid inquiry. There was no fear in her eyes, no surprise, no guilt. She simply looked at the constable as if he were a traveler who had lost his way. He told her, his voice rough with a mixture of anger and disbelief, that she was under arrest for the crime of murder. Her expression did not change. She did not protest her innocence or demand an explanation. She simply nodded once, a small, curt gesture of acknowledgement. She turned, set the candle down on a small table, retrieved a shawl, and allowed the constable to bind her wrists. Her compliance was the most unnerving thing of all. It was the calm, detached acceptance of someone for whom this moment was not a shocking interruption, but an inevitable, and perhaps even expected, conclusion. The trial of Lydia Crandall became a spectacle that drew people from 3 counties. The small wooden courtroom, with its rough-hewn benches and dusty windows, was packed to overflowing each day. The air within was thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, wet wool, and a palpable, collective tension. It was a place where the mundane architecture of local justice was forced to contain a narrative of almost mythic horror. The town that had once admired Lydia's fortitude was now forced to confront the monstrous reality that had lived, unseen, in its midst. The community was deeply divided. Some, like Margaret Tolliver, saw the trial as a grim but necessary reckoning, a lancing of a poisoned wound. Others found it impossible to reconcile the image of the quiet, hard-working widow with the brutal acts of which she was accused. They whispered that she was being framed, that the constable and the minister had been swayed by the hysterical tales of a vagrant girl and a superstitious peddler. They could not, or would not, believe that such evil could reside behind such a respectable facade. The prosecution, led by a young, ambitious lawyer from Dover, built its case with meticulous, damning detail. Constable Bell testified to the discovery in the orchard, his voice flat and professional as he described the shallow graves and their gruesome contents. His testimony laid a foundation of irrefutable physical evidence. Then, Jonas Blythe took the stand. His voice, though trembling slightly, was clear and firm as he recounted his last meeting with Isaiah Fletcher. He described the man's strength, his good nature, his powerful singing voice now silenced forever. He spoke of the unnatural quiet of the Crandall farm, a quiet he now understood to be the stillness of death. His words painted a picture of the farm as a trap, a place that lured in the hopeful only to consume them. The most powerful testimony, however, came from Ruth Green. She walked to the witness stand, a small, solitary figure clutching the carved wooden wren her brother had made for her. She did not speak of evidence or timelines. She spoke of David. She told the court about his dreams of a better life in Philadelphia, about his unfailing optimism, about the way he would hum as he worked. Her voice, choked with a grief that was still raw, filled the silent courtroom. She spoke of the lie Lydia had told her, the cold, final words that had slammed the door on her hope. Her testimony was not about the dead body in the ground. It was about the vibrant, living soul that had been extinguished. Her loss was the emotional core of the trial, a human counterpoint to the clinical horror of the unearthed bones. Reverend Obadiah Kent, a man who had once counseled caution, now took the stand to denounce the evil that had taken root in his parish. He spoke of Lydia's presence in his church, of her outward display of piety, and he condemned it as a blasphemous mockery of faith. He declared her a wolf in sheep's clothing, a cancer on the community that had to be cut out. His words, coming from the town's moral authority, swayed many of the remaining doubters. Throughout the weeks of testimony, Lydia Crandall sat impassively at the defendant's table. Her gaze was fixed on a point on the far wall, her expression unchanging. She listened to the descriptions of her crimes, to the grief of her victims' families, and to the denunciations of the minister, with the same detached calm she had shown on the night of her arrest. She offered no defense, no explanation, no plea for mercy. Her silence was her final, most unnerving weapon. It was a void into which the court, the jury, and the entire community poured their own fears and speculations. Was it madness? Was it a hatred so profound that it had become a form of religion? Was it a simple, cold-blooded avarice, killing for the few coins and meager possessions her victims carried? Her silence denied them any answer, leaving them to grapple with the terrifying possibility of a violence that was utterly without reason. The gavel of Judge Malcolm Rudd, a stern, unforgiving jurist, echoed through the tense, crowded room, signaling the end of the testimony and the beginning of deliberation. The central question now hung heavy in the air, a weight on every soul in that courtroom. In a world of clear moral lines, of good and evil, of God and the devil, could justice truly reach a woman whose motives were as inscrutable and terrifying as the silence of the barn where she had performed her terrible work? The 12 men of the jury filed out, their faces grim, leaving a town and a nation to wait for the verdict that would decide the fate of the housewife who had killed behind her barn. The jury's deliberation was a formality, a brief pause between the presentation of horror and the pronouncement of judgment. They returned in less than an hour, their faces etched with a grim and unified certainty. The verdict, when it was read into the hushed, suffocating air of the courtroom, was guilty. Judge Malcolm Rudd, a man whose stern demeanor was forged by years of witnessing the lesser failings of humanity, looked at Lydia Crandall for a long moment, his gaze searching her impassive face for any flicker of remorse, any sign of a soul within. He found nothing. He pronounced the sentence with a voice that was as cold and hard as granite. He said that she would be taken from this place to a place of execution and there be hanged by the neck until she was dead. He concluded by praying that God might have mercy on her soul, though his tone suggested he held little hope for such a divine intervention. Through it all, from the foreman's solemn declaration to the judge's final, damning words, Lydia did not react. She did not weep or cry out. She did not protest or plead. Her composure, which had been so unnerving throughout the trial, now seemed utterly monstrous in the face of her own mortality. It was the calm of a creature for whom human concepts of justice and fear held no meaning. As Constable Ezra Bell led her from the courtroom, a low murmur rippled through the crowd, a sound of relief, of fear, and of a profound, unsettling awe at the unbreachable fortress of her silence. Ruth Green stood in the back of the room, her brother's wooden bird held so tightly in her hand that its edges bit into her palm. She did not feel the triumph of vengeance, only a vast, hollow emptiness. Justice had been served, but it could not restore a single breath to the brother she had lost. The execution was carried out in the spring of 1833. The day was chosen with a kind of poetic cruelty, a bright, clear morning, the air alive with the scent of damp earth and new life. A gallows had been constructed in a public square, a raw, angular skeleton of new-cut timber that stood as a stark and ugly intrusion on the day's burgeoning beauty. A crowd gathered, their mood a strange mixture of grim duty and morbid curiosity. They were farmers, merchants, housewives, and children, all drawn to witness the final, violent punctuation mark on this dark chapter of their community's history. When Lydia was brought forth, she had not changed. Her steps were steady, her gaze distant. She ascended the gallows steps without assistance, her movements as economical and deliberate as they had been when she was mending a fence or tending her garden. The minister offered her a final chance to confess her sins, to unburden her soul before God. She looked at him, her pale eyes empty of recognition, and said nothing. A black hood was placed over her head, a final, futile attempt to hide the horror from the eyes of the spectators. But the true horror had never been in her face. It had been behind it, in the silent, unknowable country of her mind. The rope was placed around her neck. The trapdoor sprang. And then, there was only the sound of the taut rope groaning under the sudden weight, a sound that cut through the morning air and was followed by a profound, collective silence. In the aftermath, a strange amnesia seemed to settle over the town. The farm was sold at auction, but no one would buy it. The land was tainted, the soil itself considered to be poisoned by the acts that had been committed upon it. The farmhouse and the red barn were left to the wind and the rain, to the slow, inexorable reclamation by nature. The community, having excised the cancer from its midst, seemed eager to forget. The name Lydia Crandall was rarely spoken aloud. The trial became a subject to be avoided in polite conversation, a shared trauma that was best left undisturbed, but a story so dark cannot be entirely erased. It can only be transformed. As the years passed, the facts of the case began to soften and blur, worn down by time and retelling, like a stone in a river. The farm, as it fell into ruin, became a place of local legend. The farmhouse windows, shattered by thrown rocks or the simple pressure of time, became vacant eyes staring out over the overgrown fields. The roof sagged, the porch collapsed, and thorny vines, thick as a man's wrist, crawled up the walls, choking the life out of the structure. The barn, the epicenter of the horror, held on the longest. Its great, sturdy frame resisted the seasons, but eventually, the weight of winter snows proved too much. The roof gave way with a great groaning crash that was heard a mile away, a final, dying exhalation. The blood-red paint peeled and faded, the wood silvering and splintering, until the building was a skeletal ruin, a jagged silhouette against the sky. The story attached to this ruin shed its specific, documented horrors and took on the simpler, more potent shape of folklore. The woman was no longer Lydia Crandall, a person with a history and a trial. She became the widow of the orchard, a spectral figure, a local bogeyman. Children, on daring each other to approach the crumbling foundation stones of the barn, would whisper that on quiet nights, you could still hear the sound of a shovel striking the earth. They said the apples that grew on the few remaining gnarled trees in the orchard were bitter and tasted of blood. The number of victims became a fluid, unknowable thing. The 3 bodies exhumed became a dozen, then 24 in the telling. They were no longer specific men like David Green or Isaiah Fletcher, with families and histories. They were simply the nameless dead, the lost souls who had been foolish enough to trust the widow's charity. The true, documented horror of a methodical, clear-eyed killer was replaced by a more palatable, supernatural dread. It was easier to believe in a ghost than to accept that a neighbor, a simple housewife, could be a monster. The story became a cautionary tale, a piece of local color, its sharp edges of fact ground down into the smooth, familiar shape of a ghost story. The real woman and her real victims were buried a second time, this time under layers of myth and legend. More than a century and a half later, a doctoral student named Nathan Corbett was working his way through the uncatalogued archives of the Kent County Courthouse. He was a young man with a quiet, almost obsessive passion for the forgotten corners of local history, for the stories that had slipped through the cracks of the official narrative. He spent his days in the dusty, quiet room, the air thick with the scent of decaying paper and old leather, carefully turning the brittle, sepia-toned pages of court ledgers and forgotten case files. It was in a moldering cardboard box, tucked away on a high shelf, that he found the records for the trial of the State versus Lydia Crandall. The ink on the pages was faded, the clerk's spidery script difficult to decipher, but as Nathan began to read, a forgotten world came into focus. He read the clinical testimony of Constable Ezra Bell, the heartbroken words of Ruth Green, the chilling observations of Jonas Blythe. He read the newspaper clippings that had been tucked between the pages, their headlines stark and sensational. Here, stripped of all folklore, was the raw, brutal truth of the matter. It was not a ghost story. It was a meticulously documented account of a series of calculated, cold-blooded murders. The names of the victims, their histories, their humanity, were all there, preserved in the faded ink. Nathan spent weeks poring over the documents, cross-referencing names and dates, slowly reconstructing the events of 1832. The horror of the story, he realized, was not in its supernatural embellishments, but in its stark, human reality. The overgrown orchard and the barn ruins were not just a haunted place for children to whisper about. They were a crime scene. Lydia Crandall was not a spectral widow. She was a serial killer who had operated with terrifying efficiency, hidden in plain sight. The final pages of the file contained the judge's sentencing and a brief, official note confirming the date of the execution. But the file offered no answers to the one question that echoed through the century and a half of silence. It gave no hint of a motive. The core of her darkness remained as inscrutable as it had been to the jury that condemned her. The question that lingered, the one that Nathan Corbett found himself asking as he closed the brittle file, was the same one that had haunted the community after the discovery. How many more had there been? How many other travelers, whose disappearances were never reported, had met their end in that silent, terrible barn? The official record accounted for 3, but the true number was known only to the woman who took her secrets to the gallows. A final, chilling tally lost to the silence of the grave. The record on Lydia Crandall is now sealed, and our walk through this dark corridor of history is at an end. Your presence here, bearing witness to these forgotten voices, is more valued than you know. If you are new to this archive and wish to be present when the next file is opened, subscribe to the Blaspheme Archive and leave a comment to share your reflections on the story that has unfolded.